Bueno, welcome again to our second session of the day. We have Professor Christian Dahlman with us. It's a pleasure and honor for us to have you here. Christian is it's an author who needs no introduction. I'm just going to say here that he's a professor in the University of Lunds and has worked extensively in the fields, well, in lots of fields, but mainly, at least in the recent years, in criminal evidence and criminal procedure stuff, basically advocating for a Bayesian approach, and also working on the field of argumentation theory and trying to dispel the confusion or the confusion, I think is a fair word to use, surrounding certain key conceptions and key notions related to evidence. So, with no further ado, the floor is yours, Christian.
Thanks a lot, and it's great to be here in Girona. Thanks to Cordy and all the organizers for yet again a wonderful event here. I mean, I don't know, it's my fourth or fifth time here. I don't remember exactly, but it's always been great intellectually, great organization, great socially, and this time as well. So I'm really happy to be here and to see some old and some new friends. So the title of my talk is Against Plausibility. And this is kind of summing up thoughts that I've been having for a long time, reactions that I've been having for a long time to people talking about plausibility in evidence. And people here are not just scholars, but also practicing lawyers. I work at the law department, I'm a lawyer, but I also do a lot of consulting works for law firms in Sweden, so I'm involved in cases. So I see this in courts, I see this in briefs, that the term plausibility is used. I see it in verdicts in Sweden. I assume that goes for your countries as well. And I see it in the scholarly literature, that a scenario or an explanation or a hypothesis is characterized as plausible or more plausible than another, or highly plausible or implausible or whatever. I have two examples here. The first is from people in the Dutch scenario approach to legal evidence, and Ruth Macker and Peter van Koppen, where they say the defendant presents a more or less plausible scenario. The other example here is from Ron Allen. Actually, his definition here of the criminal standard of proof, after hearing all the evidence, a juror concludes that there is a plausible scenario consistent with innocence, then the juror should vote for acquittal. There are loads of other examples. I've sent my paper that I don't know if you've circulated it, but you can find other examples there. And the question is then, so what does plausible mean? What exactly are these people talking about when they're using the term plausible? As you might know, I belong to, as you already mentioned, the people who have a probabilistic approach to evidence, a Bayesian approach, where we talk about probability, which, by the way, is very precisely defined in that literature, and try to avoid as much as possible to talk about plausibility, because, at least I do, because I don't really know what I mean when I use it. I need to mention this guy. Unfortunately, he's not here, Ron. I would have hoped him to be here, because this presentation is in a sense a against Ron Allen kind of presentation. You can call him up, yeah, exactly, yeah. But I mean, I would say that it's also for Ron Allen. That's why it's a pity that he isn't here. We disagree intellectually on stuff about evidence, but we're very good friends, so this is in no way personal. This is just an intellectual disagreement on what kind of approach and vocabulary is most useful to have on legal evidence. And I can say, after some decades in academia, that if you're doing philosophy or theorizing, there are kind of two things that can happen to you. Either you're ignored or you're misunderstood and misquoted. So you can see this as that it's a tribute to Ron, because I'm now going to misunderstand and misquote him. I'm not going to ignore him in this presentation. So as you know, Ron has for decades been advocating for the so-called relative plausibility theory. So already from the term here, relative plausibility, we understand that plausibility plays a central role in his theory. And I'm not going to go into detail, I assume you know it. It's basically the idea is that legal trials are a kind of battle between rival stories that are presented against each other, and it's up to the fact finder to assess these stories in terms of plausibility and relative plausibility. Okay, so is how plausible is the plaintiff's explanation of the evidence versus the defendant's, and that's what the assessment of the evidence is about. And depending on then if it's a civil case or a criminal case, then various standards of proof are applied that hinge on plausibility. But my question is, what exactly does it mean that a hypothesis scenario explanation is plausible? And as a lawyer, what we're used to is that the key terms in law, if you go to textbooks on law, books on law, not books on philosophy, but law books, books that are studied in law schools, the key terms are normally precisely defined. So that's what you would expect. But not so with plausibility. This is a term that's frequently used in all kinds of legal systems. It's used in Scandinavian systems, it's used by courts, the Swedish Supreme Court has used it, it's used in textbooks, but it's very difficult to find a definition of it anywhere, which is kind of puzzling. And I've been asking Ron and also the Dutch scenario people who use this term frequently, so what exactly can you give a definition? And I know that a lot of other people have pressed them on this as well, because you can see it in the literature. But so far, they have been unwilling to give a definition. Ron Allen actually says explicitly, I've been talking to him about this many times, that it's not necessarily. Here's a quote from a paper from 2010 where he says that identifying precisely what motivates choice is not necessary. Plausibility can exist happily as an undefined primitive. Well, I'm not very happy about it. And Ron Allen's been criticized for this. I have several references in the paper from people like Eivind Kohlflat, for example, Alicia Karikari, and other people who have said that this is a problem with relative plausibility, that this central key term is not properly defined. One simple solution here, of course, that we can offer from the probabilistic camp would be to say, well, it's just another word for probability. Plausible means probable. So you can we have the entire literature over here on what probability means, So you can just piggyback on that whole thing if you like. We're happy to offer it. But Ron Allen has explicitly rejected this and said no. And this goes for other people who use plausibility, also for the Dutch scenario people and others have said, no. You probability guys, you missed the point here. Plausibility means something different. It's not just reducible to probability. There is something else in this that you guys are, that we see that you don't really see. So it cannot reduce it. It means something more or different. Okay? So what exactly is that other thing that is captured by plausibility? And some people have said, Dahlman, for example, that he thinks that it seems that if you press Ron Allen on his relative plausibility theory, that it seems to kind of reduce to probability at the end. So there is this, but Ron Allen says no. Okay, so it's something else. In my talk today, I'm going to make 3 claims. The first claim is that plausibility is a highly ambiguous term. It doesn't, if you look at how it's used in evidence discourse, it's not used in one sense. It's used in many different senses. So people are actually sliding between different meanings. Over the years, when I've been trying to understand this, I've looked at different authors writing about it, and I thought, okay, so this is the meaning, aha, and then I read something else, and well, wait a minute, this doesn't square well, and so I've come to collect in my own endeavor to understand this different meanings that I've come across. And so far I've found 8 different meanings in the scholarly literature on legal evidence. 8 distinctly different meanings of plausibility. So this means that it's a highly ambiguous, equivocal term. And this is just a question of how it's used. I don't claim that this list of 8 is exhaustive. There might be even more out there. If you find some more, let me know. My second claim is that if you look at each and every one of those 8 different meanings, they can all be exactly defined in terms of probability. So each and every one of them can be provided with a precise definition, probabilistic definition. Which means that plausibility can actually be reduced to probability. But in 8 different senses. Which, oxygen, great, thanks. Yeah. So if I'm right about this claim, then Ron and other people who have said that plausibility entails something other that cannot be reduced to probability are wrong. And my third claim or point here is that having a key term in evidence discourse that is so highly ambiguous in this way is not acceptable. It's not acceptable in legal practice from a normative point of view, and it's not acceptable if you use plausibility in a descriptive sense as a part of a hypothesis about what's actually going on out there. It's not acceptable to have such ambiguity in a scientific hypothesis from a scientific point of view. So but I will get back to that in the end. So let's see first the 8 different meanings that I've found. I have called them plausible as possible, plausible as conceivable, plausible as more probable than not, plausible as front runner, plausible as predictive, plausible as prima facie more probable than not, and plausible as prima facie front runner, and plausible as promising. So let's go through them. In the paper there are more examples. Here I will not bother you with many examples of this kind of use. So the first one, plausible as possible. That simply means if something, well, this is plausible, it means that it could be the case, it's possible. There is not a zero probability of this hypothesis. If an hypothesis scenario is plausible in this sense, it's not completely ruled out. You can see some examples of this. There is in the paper an example where Andrew Macker and Peter van Koppen use plausibility in this sense. But possibility doesn't say much, does it? I mean, something can be possible but be very improbable. So you also see, I think a quite common use of plausible is to say plausible means that it's not just possible, but it's practically conceivable. I mean, it has a probability that's considerably higher than 0. So it's smaller than 50-50, but it's something to be taken into account. But then again, there are other uses when it means something stronger, where plausible means that it's more probable than not. So when someone say this is plausible, then they mean this is more probable than the alternative. So here you have 3 different uses. A fourth use is when different explanations or hypotheses are ranked, which is quite popular among people who have a non-probabilistic approach to evidence, that not wanting to quantify things, but rather to rank things. So what you want to say now is that if you have several hypotheses, that this one is plausible means that it's the highest ranked, which could then probabilistically be defined like this. So it's simply the hypothesis with the highest probability. I don't know if you're familiar with the book that Nicholas Rescher wrote in the 1970s about plausibility, where he has this kind of approach of saying that plausibility is something that is, he says it's more primitive than probability, it's more qualitative, and it's about ranking hypotheses or explanations. Here, in this version, it's the front runner, so it's the most probable. I do think that there is a variation here as well, so it would actually be a 4B or a 9th one, where plausible sometimes would mean one of the front runners, not necessarily the front runner. Then we have plausible as predictive. And here's the point where us Bayesians think that, so here it's important to think correctly about your conditionals. Because as you saw before, all of those statements were about the probability of the hypothesis given some evidence. But we also have what in probability theory is called the likelihood. which is the probability of seeing the evidence given that the hypothesis is true. Which is an important part of the so-called likelihood ratio, which is an important diagnostic tool in Bayesian analysis. But it seems to me that if you look at how plausibility is used, this kind of thing that is also present in non-explicitly Bayesian kind of reasoning. I see a lot of people who talk about plausibility in a way where they're actually kind of low-tech Bayesians. They reason in a way that pretty much would fit and could be formalized in Bayesian terms, but in a different vocabulary. And when they do this, they also reason about likelihoods, but they don't use the term likelihood, they don't talk about false positives or true positives. They rather say something like, so whether this explains the evidence well, whether this is what you would expect to see, whether this is predictive, as some kind of diagnostic test on whether this is the evidence strongly supports the hypothesis or not. So if something is highly predicted, which then means that if the hypothesis is true, then what we see is highly probable. We see exactly what we expect to see. Then that is something that indicates that the evidence strongly supports the hypothesis. As every Bayesian would tell you, of course, you have to be careful here, because you would also have to ask to what extent alternative hypotheses are predicted. So, if it's the case that the alternative hypothesis is just as predictive of the evidence, then the main hypothesis doesn't support the evidence that much. Maybe not at all. A classical example that I have in the paper is, suppose, for example, you have a case, a woman has been found murdered, and you have a suspect, and you find DNA on the body that matches the suspect. Then someone would say, well, this is, if the hypothesis, main hypothesis that he did it, then that's very predictive. That's exactly what we expect to find if he did it. Okay, but is it what we expect to find if he didn't do it? Well, that depends. If they had no connection to each other, you wouldn't expect to find it. But suppose it's the husband that's the suspect, then, and they live together, then you would expect to find his DNA on her even if he didn't do it. So then it's also predictive of the alternative hypothesis. And this shows that when you talk about likelihoods of predictiveness, you could have a case where the main hypothesis is highly predictive, but also the alternative hypothesis. As opposed to, for example, plausible as more probable than not. It's not possible that the main hypothesis is more probable than not, and at the same time, the alternative hypothesis cannot at the same time also be more probable than not. That's not possible. And therefore, you sometimes see, here's an example from Rescher, but other people in the plausibility literature have said this as well, that the difference between plausibility and probability is that two competing hypotheses can both be plausible, but they cannot both be probable. So here is someone trying to argue that there is actually a difference, an important difference. Well, I say, nah, wait a minute. That's not what's going on here. What's going on is that plausible is ambiguous. And in some meanings of plausible, it's true that two competing hypotheses cannot at the same time be plausible. When we're using plausible in the sense of more probable than not, that's not possible. But if we slide to a different meaning of plausibility, plausible as predictive, then it suddenly is possible that two competing hypotheses can both be plausible used in this sense. And it's the same thing with the front runner, as I said before. If front runner means that, okay, plausible as front runner, one of the most probable hypotheses, then you can also imagine that in that sense you can have two hypotheses that are competing that are both among the front runners. So it's not that this is a difference between plausibility and probability. It's actually a difference between some meaning of plausibility and some other meaning of plausibility. Okay, so now we have this prima facie business. This is something that actually, Andrew Macker recently wrote a paper about this, and other people have written about it as well. This idea that the relationship between plausibility and probability is somehow temporal. That plausibility is what we talk about at the start of a case, when we know little. And then the more we gather evidence and the more we know, we start to talk about probability instead. So that if we would find a woman who's murdered, the investigator could say, well, probably, or it's plausible that the husband did it. Why would he say that? We haven't yet investigated anything. Well, it's because he knows from statistics that when a woman is found dead, then it's more probable than not that the husband did it. In most of those cases, it was the husband or the partner. So that would be this kind of prima facie use of plausible. And the thing with this is that it then uses very little evidence, but it's based on some kind of background information here about this particular hypothesis. For instance, this background statistic that most women who are found dead are killed by their partners. And given this situation early in the investigation, it's prima facie more probable than not that he did it. Then it might turn out, when we gather more evidence, that we actually find stuff that shows that he didn't do it and it was someone else. But this is like a prima facie kind of thing. And we would therefore also have the kind of the front runner thing can apply to the prima facie as well. You could say that, well, given what we know about these kinds of cases in general, this is one of the typically hypotheses that normally, one of those that normally turn out to be true. But of course, then when we gather more evidence, it can be the case that it's actually some other unlikely thing that has happened. And at last, we have this thing that you see sometimes. You also have this in the scenario literature, plausible as promising, which is a kind of tricky thing. So the thing is here, the argument would be that, okay, so when I say that this is plausible, it means that it's kind of a good candidate for investigation. It's something that a police would say that this is something that should be investigated because I know from experience that this kind of hypothesis will often generate evidence that will increase in probability. So this is a little trickier to represent probabilistically, because what's going on here is actually a second order probability, because you're going to have a situation here with the probability here on the prima facie evidence, and then we imagine some further investigation I here that will generate this further evidence. And what we're saying is that in the future, when we have this further evidence, the probability will be higher than the probability is now for this hypothesis. And we're conditioning this whole thing on our background knowledge about these kinds of investigations, what they normally generate. And then we say that the probability that that gathering of information will increase the probability of the hypothesis is positive or much greater than zero or whatever. So this is what promising means. It's a kind of tricky because you have to model it as a second order probability. But again, it can be reduced to probability. So, those are the 8 different uses that I found. Again, I'm not claiming that it's exhaustive. But my argument, my third claim, is that this is a big problem. And the problem only becomes bigger if there are additional uses as well. It's a problem both for legal practice and for legal science to have a key term that is ambiguous, where uses of that term slides back and forth between different meanings. Why is it a problem for legal practice? Yeah, that's quite obvious. If we have a standard of proof that relies on a term that is not precisely defined, but that can slide between different meanings, there is a great risk that fact finders will not use this standard or apply this as standard of proof consistently, but slide between different meanings, which will have the consequences that like cases will not be treated alike. So, if we want fair trial and the rule of law to be upheld, that like cases are treated alike, we should demand more from a normative point of view from our theory than this undefined central term. As you know, Ron Allen often says, but my theory is not normative. I think it is, but okay. He often says that, no, this is a descriptive theory. This is a theory of, I'm only describing, this is the descriptive hypothesis of what's actually happening outside, out there in the courtrooms. So I'm just saying that the relative plausibility theory just simply is a hypothesis that describes what fact finders do. Well, if we take it as such, then we would say that, okay, Ron, you're saying that you're doing science here. He's very, he often wears that on his cuff, that he says, I'm doing legal science. He often uses this term. So, okay, then the terms that you use and the methodology that you use should stand up to scientific requirements. And so, and what requirements do we have in science of hypotheses? Well, it's that they are precise. Because what Ron supposedly does and what science does is that we set up a hypothesis and then we go out and we gather data and then we compare the data with the hypothesis and we see, does it fit, doesn't it fit, does it agree, is this the hypothesis corroborated, or is there something that we see out there in the courts that doesn't fit? Well, Ron's been doing this for decades, and everything he's always seen always fits with his hypothesis. And he's taken this to mean that this must mean that's a great hypothesis. It must be true because everything I see fits with it. Yeah, maybe the problem is that the hypothesis is so imprecise and can be interpreted in so many different ways that no matter what courts do out there, you can always see from your point of view that this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about plausibility. As Karl Popper taught us, in order for a procedure to be scientific, in order for a procedure to be a real scientific test, the hypothesis must be sufficiently precise so that it can fail. It cannot be so open and ambiguous that whatever we see confirms the hypothesis. Then all those corroborations, confirmations, are scientifically worthless. I could come up with a rival theory. Relative quasi-Bayesianism or something. That is some kind of also loosely defined theory that this is actually what courts do. As I said before, a lot of common sense argumentation can be interpreted by us Bayesians as, well, this is kind of a low-tech kind of base. So, I mean, if we just define, or not define rather, if we just speak in a rather unprecise way about what this quasi-Bayesian hypothesis is, then I could observe what's going out there in the courts, and everything I see, I could, in one sense or the other, say, well, that fits with the Bayesian approach. But that would be rather useless. Just as useless as all the confirmation that Ron Allen sees to his relative plausibility theory. So, to wrap this up, I don't know how much time I had, but I've been talking for a while.
You have 4 minutes.
I have 4 minutes. Well, these are my conclusions. This is, first of all, plausibility is ambiguous. It's used in an ambiguous way. And not just ambiguous between two different meanings, between lots of different meanings. Plausibility in each of these meanings can be properly defined in terms of probability. So this claim that plausibility stands for something that cannot be reduced to probability, I have not, so far not seen what that is. And that therefore, this ambiguity, this equivocation with all these different meanings, since this is unacceptable from a practical point of view, from the point of view of the ideals and values of fair trial and the rule of law, and also is unacceptable from scientific point of view, there is no reason to continue this plausibility talk. But it would be better for legal practice, and it would be better for legal science if we would all just abandon this and talk about probability instead. So, okay, thanks for your attention.